35 years ago, fly the Atlantic. Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon.
Welcome to the Jack Yates Community Forum. I'm your host, Sir Black, and today our guest is Dr. Chris Kraft. Dr. Kraft was the director of the Johnson Space Center located here in Houston, Texas from 1972 to 1982. He was one of the original members of the Space Task Group selected in 1958. He has recently just published his first book, Flight, and funds from the book will benefit children of employees at the NASA Johnson Space Center. I would like to welcome to you all the first NASA flight director and the man they call Flight, Dr. Chris Kraft.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, let's get to the first question.
Okay.
You saw Charles Lindbergh land the Spirit of St. Louis in Virginia.
Yes, I did.
When you were only 4 years old. Did you think then that you would grow up to be involved in landing men on the moon?
No, that was the farthest thought from my mind. I was more thinking about Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig than I was Charles Lindbergh and going to the moon.
Well, tell me about that. I heard that you were able to get Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig to autograph some baseballs.
Yes, I was. I went to Washington 2 or 3 times a year with my parents. We'd drive all day and see the ball game and drive all night to get back to where we lived. And I saw Babe Ruth in Washington several times and got his signature on a baseball, as I did Lou Gehrig. I talk about that in my book.
Now, you say that we could have beaten the Russians into space, but doctors, bureaucrats, and von Braun allowed Yuri Gagarin to beat Al Shepard into space. Can you explain this?
Well, we were ready to fly in February of 1961, and we flew a Redstone rocket, and the Redstone rocket had some problems with it. They weren't problems that would have caused a safety issue, but they were problems in their understanding the engine at the time, and so the German rocketeers wanted to fly another rocket to make sure it was working okay. I don't think any of us thought that was necessary, but they were being careful. And as a result, we had to postpone the scheduled launch of Alan Shepard. And in the meantime, Gagarin flew. And I'm certain in my mind that we could have flown Alan Shepard first. Now, it would have been a ballistic flight. I mean, we just shot him up and brought him down. He was only at 0 G for 6 minutes, whereas Gagarin actually went around the Earth in orbit and came back down in Russia. But it still would have been a publicity coup in my mind.
Okay. Well, Scott Carpenter's Mercury flight proved mission control to be a necessity because Carpenter ignored requests from the ground to check his instruments, and he nearly died. Can you explain how you brought him down safely and saved his life?
I think we got him down very fortunately. And fortunately, we had Alan Shepard in California that could talk him into doing the retrofire and getting into the position to fire the retro rockets. He had floundered and gotten rid of all of his propellant, messing around with the spacecraft. He was using the controls, both automatic and manual, and almost run out of fuel. And when he came up on Hawaii and when he was supposed to be in retrofire attitude, that is the right attitude to fire his rockets, he was turned the wrong way. And it was touch and go, and I think Mr. Shepard should get the credit for talking him into the right attitude and giving him the directions as to how to fire the rockets manually, which he did. And he was late in firing them, and he was at the wrong angle when he fired the rockets. So that extended his time at high G during entry. He got up to about 12 G, when normal entry was around 9, which is very high anyway. So he was a very fortunate young man that he did get down, and we were very happy to see him in the water on the ground, because he was pretty close to losing his life due to burning up in the atmosphere.
Well, at the end of Mercury, President Kennedy gave you the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal. How did that feel?
Oh, that was very exciting. Mr. Kennedy was very much a hero and our guy in the White House. And he came to the control center after John Glenn flew, and I got to meet him there. And then after Cooper flew, I was asked to the White House Rose Garden and given the Outstanding Leadership Medal among a lot of great people there. I hope you have a picture of that showing, because that was a very proud moment for me and my wife. It was a proud moment for the flight control team to see one of us recognized as much as Cooper was recognized, because he received the medal on the same day that I did in the Rose Garden. So it was a great time. It was a great experience for me and one of my proudest moments in life.
I'm sure we'll be able to get that picture in also.
I hope so.
But can you tell me about the honor of being on the cover of Time magazine on August 27th, 1965?
Well, that was quite an experience also. I was invited to New York. I didn't know that they were considering me and Dr. Berry, as Dr. Berry was the astronaut's doctor at the time. They were considering the two of us for the cover. And we had a discussion with them in their offices in New York City, and I think they were impressed with both of us, but decided that maybe I was more exciting for their cover than Dr. Berry. I'm not sure that was right, but it was the way it was done. And that was very pleasing for me. But again, I think it was recognition of the NASA manned space program and recognition of the flight control team that we had developed, the operations team that we had developed, and recognition, of course, of the astronauts who were the heroes of the time and had a lot of guts to fly in space at that time in our history. Rockets were not too reliable in those days, and the equipment we had on the spacecraft was not too reliable either. So we were very fortunate to get the programs done, and that particular flight following my being on the cover was a very touchy situation also, because the fuel cells were under stress, and the oxygen system supplying the fuel for the fuel cell was also having problems. But that was true almost of every flight we flew. We had a lot of problems that the flight control team had to deal with.
Well, you say that the Gemini program seldomly gets proper credit. Can you explain how the Gemini bridged the technology gaps that made Apollo possible?
Well, we did everything on Gemini that we had to get done on Apollo. We had fuel cells for the first time instead of batteries. We had an automatic navigation and guidance system for re-entry. We had a computer on board. We had to do 14 days in space to prove that man could survive for that length of time at zero gravity. And finally, and probably most importantly, we were able to perfect both rendezvous and EVA on Gemini. We didn't know how to do extravehicular activity for the astronaut to go outside the spacecraft, and it took a lot of learning during Gemini to get that done. And we didn't know how to do rendezvous. We knew what the orbital mechanics were, but we didn't know the practical parts of having to do rendezvous with where the lighting should be, where the sun should be, how the astronauts used the radar system, and the closing rates and the closing final minutes of docking, and we had never docked before. So all of that we found out how to do in Gemini as a precursor to flying to the moon on Apollo, where we had to rendezvous at the moon with the command and service module and the lunar module. So Gemini, in my mind, was an absolute necessity to the lunar program.
Well, during Apollo 8, while the astronauts were in lunar orbit over Christmas Eve in 1968, they read from Genesis, and you say there was not a dry eye in the room.
You bet.
Can you explain that?
Well, Apollo 8 was, in my mind, the greatest flight in manned spaceflight history, because we hadn't planned to do it. We took a lot of risk in sending men to the moon for the first time. We'd never flown a man on the Saturn V rocket, which had to fire and then fire again to send them to the moon. We had to commit to a 6 or 7 day flight on the command and service module. We had to commit to the proper operation of our worldwide network and the deep space network to track the vehicle as it approached the moon. We were going to go to the moon and for the first time fire the rocket so that we would be in orbit around the moon at 90 to 60 miles above the surface of the moon. As a matter of fact, I had my boss in Washington ask me, was I sure I wanted to do that? Why didn't I do it at 300 or 400 miles? And I didn't want to do that because when we went to go to land on the moon, we were going to do it at 90 and 60. And the other thing we needed to know was how to do lunar orbit determination, which we didn't know how to do very well because those big craters on the moon turned out to have large masses in the bottom of them, which were called mascons, and that's the first time we recognized that the gravitational model that we had for the moon was in error, so that we couldn't predict where the spacecraft was going to be as it came back around the moon. So all of that on Apollo 8 was accomplished the first time. That was truly the greatest decision I've ever seen made in the space program, and probably one of the greatest decisions ever made in government. To be willing to take that risk on that flight was quite something. And you have to give credit to the government all the way up to the president, because they all decided that they were willing to take that risk. And we didn't pull any punches in telling them what the risks were either. So I say Apollo 8 was a great flight, and the success of that mission was what allowed us to land the men on the moon in 1969 for sure.
Well, you say that landing on the moon is not at all how they show it in the movies.
Right.
And you said it's actually like the pilots are flying backwards and they're landing on the moon when they can't even see it.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yes. Well, in order to utilize the rocket power that you have in the engine on the lunar module as you approach the moon, you have to be firing the rocket in the direction that you're going in order to slow yourself down and make the proper approach to the landing site. So in order to do that, they're looking at first, actually looking up, and they're on their back with the spacecraft going in this direction, and they're looking in the other direction. And we fixed the trajectory so that when they got within about 10,000 feet, then we roll the spacecraft over, which was the first time they could see the moon, and also we began a more steep descent. And that was the first time they could really see where they were going. That was required because we didn't have any better performance in the rockets that we had. Now, as they got close to the moon, then we tilted it over even further, and they were able to fly the machine much as you fly a helicopter. And Mr. Armstrong was very, very fortunate to be able to do that, because where we were going to land was full of boulders, and he had to move the spacecraft over. We didn't know that as he was approaching, but that's what he was doing, and he was very fortunate he didn't run out of propellant. So that whole descent to the moon was a very exciting time, not only for the astronauts, but for all of us in mission control.
Well, Apollo 12 was hit by lightning on liftoff, and Flight Director Gary Griffin made the decision to send them on to the moon. Explain why it was one of the most gutsiest decisions made during Apollo.
Well, I think that's a good question. When you realize that, for instance, you're driving down the Gulf Freeway and your car got struck by lightning, and you would wonder whether the instruments were telling you the right thing, whether the speedometer was still working, whether it destroyed all your electrical power, and whether the system was going to work today in all these computers they have in the car because of the electronic signals that had hit your stray signals that hit your systems. And that's what happened as this spacecraft was taking off. It literally knocked all the power off. It shut down the fuel cells, and the pilots were actually in a totally black spacecraft. There were no lights at all. And they were able, by direction from the ground, to restart the fuel cells, to get the instruments back working, and put the spacecraft into orbit as that took place. So how much damage now has been done? So the people in mission control had to devise some tests to check the computer, to check the navigation and guidance system, to check the fuel system, to check the electronics that was controlling all this, while they were orbiting the Earth for about 2.5 hours, getting ready to then go the next step to be fired by the rockets of the third stage of the Saturn V on the way to the moon. That took a lot of doing, it took a lot of nerve, it took a lot of know-how, and in the end took a lot of guts to make that decision that, okay, we think everything is okay, so we're ready to continue. And remember, we had the lunar module buried in the top of the Saturn V, and you couldn't really check that out at all until you got to on the way to the moon, and you had docked and gotten it back out of the Saturn V, and then several days later you were able to check out the lunar module to see whether it was still okay. Fortunately, it was. So it took a lot of nerve, a lot of guts to do that.
Okay, well, explain how Gene Kranz made the decision during Apollo 13 to seal off 3 oxygen bottles from the CM and saved their lives.
Well, I think that that was a very scary evening. We did not really know what had happened to the spacecraft. We knew that they had had some kind of an explosion. We knew that that pilots were, particularly Lovell, was seeing oxygen spewing out of what he thought was oxygen or something spewing out of the back end of the spacecraft. And we knew immediately that the oxygen system was probably destroyed and leaking rapidly. And there were 3 small oxygen bottles that were fed off that same system in the command module, the command module being in front of the service module where all this explosion took place. And had he not had the foresight to shut down and close the valves on those 3 bottles, then he would have had no oxygen left in the command module for reentry at a later period. So it was very important that he do that. Now, it was also important to make many decisions that he and the people on the ground made as the spacecraft then continued on to the back around the moon and back to the Earth again. We didn't know what engines we could use. We weren't sure the navigation and guidance system was working properly. We had to make sure that the oxygen they were breathing inside the spacecraft was being properly filtered in order to get rid of the carbon dioxide that was building up in the spacecraft. So there are a lot of things that Mr. Kranz and his flight control team and, frankly, the total system, that is the engineers both at the Johnson Space Center, Manned Spacecraft Center then, and the people from North America who were responsible for the command and service module. That was a great team effort to get that spacecraft back to Earth safely and as well as we did without losing those 3 men.
Well, you know, we actually had the pleasure of interviewing Gene Kranz
Yes.
Not too long ago.
Yes.
Actually. Okay.
Kranz is a very great man. He's did a marvelous job as a flight controller, as a flight director, and he was a great leader of his people. They had a high regard for him. I had a high regard for him. And I think that he is classical of the type of people that end up being flight directors and, frankly, being at the Johnson Space Center today. I think they're dedicated people. They're committed to doing the job well, to doing it safely. They value the lives of the astronauts, and you have to put yourself in a position of being responsible for lives every day, and that's not easily done. You can't walk away from that. The word political correctness goes flying away when you have to make decisions that whose people's lives depend upon you making good decisions and the correct ones. So I have high regard for Mr. Kranz and the people that have followed him.
Well, tell me about the midnight press conference during Apollo 13, where you in your book say that you could see how worried you looked.
Well, I didn't know how worried I was looking. I was worried. There was no question about that. And until I saw the tape of the press conference, I didn't realize how worried I was, because Kranz was too busy in the control center, and we needed somebody from the senior management to go convince the press and the outside world that we had things under control. And so I was elected by Bob Gilruth and George Lowe to go briefed the press, and they asked a lot of very tough questions, and I tried my best to give them the correct answers, and but it was a worrisome time. I thought we had the machine under control, but you're never sure of that, and fortunately we did.
Well, in the Ron Howard film Apollo 13, you say the arguments in Mission Control never happened. And can you comment on the accuracy of that movie and the HBO series From Earth to Moon, where you and Suzanne Borman argue in the backyard, and the short movie The Right Stuff?
That's a big mouthful. Well, let's start with The Right Stuff. The Right Stuff is total satire. There's nothing right about The Right Stuff as far as technical qualities are concerned. So I wiped that movie off as being total satire, and I didn't like it. Apollo 13 is a great movie. It's very well done. I think that they capture the tenseness that's on the ground, they capture the qualities of the people, and they did a fantastic job of explaining what happened on Apollo 13, although they got the actual what happened in the tank incorrect. The rest of the movie technically was well done. Now, they had to create drama in order to make the movie more interesting, and therefore a lot of the things you saw taking place in Mission Control did not take place. We didn't argue that way. We expressed our opinions. We did talk about what we should do and how we should do it, and everybody had their say, but we never got any great arguments as they depicted in the movie. As for Susan Borman and myself, that's a lot of nonsense. Susan Borman is a very great friend of mine. She was then, she is now, and even Mr. Lovell in his book said that we didn't speak to each other for 2 years. I don't know where he was, but he certainly wasn't near Susan Borman, because indeed when Frank Borman came back from that flight, we had dinner together. So all of those things get done because they want to make things more dramatic. I don't have any problem with that as long as people realize that it is drama and not really reality.
Okay. Well, do you feel in reference to manned exploration of our solar system, America turned into a nation of quitters after Apollo?
Well, that's sort of a tough way to put it, that we are quitters. No, I don't think we're quitters. I think that we just don't see the need for doing advanced space exploration. I don't think the Congress thinks that's the right way to spend the taxpayers' money. And I think that the president, particularly today, is overwhelmed by all the problems he has around him, both politically and in the war on terrorism. So I think that technology requirements, space flight, which drives those technology requirements, is sort of not on the radar screen, so to speak, of the people in charge of the money. I think that that's probably too bad. I think that we should be spending a certain amount of our money on research and development. I think the space program is a classic example of how it should be built, because it does provide a big push, a big shot in the arm to the advancement in the state of the art. It's been that way in this country, though, forever. I don't think you could find many people that thought Lewis and Clark was the right way to spend our money. I don't think that Christopher Columbus convinced many people other than Isabel that he should go off discovering a new country. And what comes out of those explorations is not just the science and the discovery of where you go, but it's the way it's the getting there and the preparation to get there and the demands on the technological capability of the country that makes it worth the investment.
Well, on a more positive note, what do you feel is the greatest achievement of the Space Shuttle program?
Of the Space Shuttle? Well, in the first place, the greatest achievement was flying it, because it was taking an airplane and flying it from Mach 25 to touchdown. It's actually an unstable airplane, and making it stable all the way through that flying regime is almost a miracle in itself. So that's quite an accomplishment. However, I think that there are hundreds of ideas and new things that have come out of the flight of the Space Shuttle. They had instruments inside the spacecraft. They had a small space station inside the spacecraft. They put up satellites. They put up the Hubble telescope. They've rebuilt the Hubble telescope. They've carried people to and from the space station. They will continue to do that. I think it's a machine we will probably fly for the next 30 years, and it certainly has performed what we designed it to do, so I'm very proud of the space shuttle itself. I'm sorry to see actually NASA trying to replace it, because I think they could spend their money better by just updating the present space shuttle and spending their money in R&D to go back into space and onto the moon and Mars.
Well, as a final question for today, you say a mission to Mars would be a great investment in health, safety, security, and education for Americans. Do you see that dream coming true in the future?
Oh, I don't think there's any question that man is going to go to Mars, and I think that it's only a question of when, not how, not why. And I think that whenever we do it, the country will benefit greatly by it, from the technological ideas and equipment and new approaches to doing things that will come out of that venture. Plus, I think that we will find probably a lot more about man and his ability to survive on this Earth and probably survive in the solar system. I also think that the exploration of space will further give us the knowledge of how to better take care of the Earth, as well as give us an idea of other civilizations that most certainly must exist out in the universe where we reside. We're a very small part of the universe, and when we find out that there are civilizations out there that may be billions of years ahead of us, then that truly will be a new idea for the people on Earth.
Amazing idea. Well, we'd like to thank you again for coming out and taking time out of your busy schedule. So thank you, Dr. Kraft.
Thank you very much.
All right, once again, this is the Jack Yates Community Forum. I am your host, Sir Black, and until next time.
35 years ago, fly the Atlantic. Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
We choose to go to the moon. 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 We choose to go to the moon.